Okay, so now let's move to the second approach, which is the income approach. And this is based on the fact that because total expenditures must be equal to total income, GDP can also be written as summing up all the incomes. So all the incomes, those are wages, which is income for the owners of factor labor. Then we have interest payment, that is income of owners of factor capital. Then we have rental income, that's income of owners of factor land. And we have profits, that's income of corporations, firms, but it's also income. And then we have taxes on production and imports, and that is income for the government. And I think all those are pretty straightforward. And so ultimately the taxes on production, it's basically, the source from which the government pays or finances its services, so that's like income. What is not so clear is maybe consumption of fixed capital. Why does that count towards gross domestic product? So why is depreciation considered to be part of income? Well, so technically it is not, because let's say if I punch on my computer and every keystroke wears out my keys and eventually I have to replace it, I don't pay my computer any income. So, but the way to think about it is that because I'm sitting here and I'm wearing out my keyboard, I generate income, right? So that helps me still, nevertheless, to get, my monthly salary. So I basically use still my keyboard, even though I don't pay it directly anything, I use it to generate my own income. Because if I couldn't type on any computer, it wouldn't take long, and my employer would tell me, what, we don't pay you anymore because you don't do any work. So the very fact that I use up capital, which is depreciating in the process, it still generates income for me. So it needs to be counted. It is basically my own income. So by using up my own capital, so I sit now at home and I use up my own capital in order to get my salary. So I use up that resource, and using up that resource basically pays me a salary, so I need to count it as income. And so technically you could say capital receives depreciation as income, but of course that's not a payment, but from a logical perspective it should be counted as income. And in this case I get income. So the capital depreciation, as the wear and tear of my equipment and computers and keyboards and whatnot, that generates income to me, so it needs to be counted. And there is of course something else, which is net GDP. And net GDP is essentially GDP minus depreciation. And sometimes net GDP is associated with sustainable GDP. So now you may sometimes read that too, sustainable GDP, because whatever is left over after I have my GDP, and I also subtract depreciation, and let's say I also subtract all my other operational expenses, I basically get the operational profit, right? So that is like if I subtract from GDP all my operational expenses like interest payment, rental income and profits and taxes, but also depreciation, I basically end up with my true operational profit. So if I do not, so sometimes sustainable GDP is just preferred. But when we talk about gross domestic product, we generate income from it by using up our capital, so we need to count it somewhere. Okay, so I hope that is clear. And in the next video, we'll talk about the value-added approach.